The world has often looked to Silicon Valley for its most daring visionaries, but sometimes the next great innovator comes from a place no one expects. In the bustling heart of Africa, a man named Kelvin is quietly building something that could reshape the future of an entire continent. They call him the African Elon, not because he's trying to copy Elon Musk, but because his ambition matches the scale of the world's boldest tech leaders. His dream is not a new car, a reusable rocket, or a social media platform. Kelvin's mission is far more personal and urgent. He wants to connect every single person in Africa to the internet, no matter how remote their village might be. For him, this isn't just about technology. It's about dignity, opportunity, and giving millions the same digital voice that the rest of the world takes for granted.
Et en vision a vast network of satellite orbiting high above the Earth, blanketing Africa in high speed, low latency internet access.
This is not just a fantasy drawn on the back of a napkin. Kelvin's project is already in motion, attracting investors, engineers, and policymakers who see the potential for a digital revolution. But to truly understand why this matters, you have to understand the man behind the mission. Kelvin grew up in a small town where internet access was rare and expensive. His earliest memories of the internet were not of streaming movies or playing online games, but of walking miles to the nearest city to use a computer for 10 minutes. Those brief moments online were like stepping into another universe. He could read articles from the United States, learn about inventions in Japan, and see images from the streets of Paris, all while sitting in a dimly lit internet cafe in Africa. But those moments were fleeting. He knew that the majority of people in his community would never experience the internet in the same way, not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't afford to. This reality bothered him deeply, even as a child. He started asking himself why Africa, a continent with so much talent and potential, was still left behind in the digital revolution. By his teenage years, Kelvin had developed a fascination with telecommunications technology. He scavenged broken radios, dismantled old satellite dishes, and read any electronics manual he could find. His family didn't have the money to buy him new tools, so he worked with whatever scraps he could find in local junkyards. This tinkering became his classroom, and failure became his teacher. He learned that signals could be transmitted over great distances if you could just figure out how to amplify and direct them. He also learned that while towers and cables could connect cities, they were useless for reaching the most rural parts of Africa. That's when the idea of satellites first lodged itself in his mind. Satellites didn't care about mountains, deserts, or political borders. They could beam internet directly to the most isolated school, clinic, or farm. But there was a problem. Satellites were expensive, and launching them was even more costly. Kelvin knew he would need both technical innovation and bold business strategy to make it happen. After finishing school, he worked odd jobs to save enough money to attend a university program in electrical engineering. It wasn't easy. Sometimes he skipped meals just to afford his course materials. But he didn't just study for grades. He studied to solve a problem. While most of his classmates focused on getting jobs at existing telecom companies, Kelvin was sketching designs for a satellite constellation that didn't yet exist. At first, people laughed at his ideas. Some told him it was impossible for an African startup to compete with global giants like SpaceX or OneWeb. Others said no investor would take such a risk in an unproven market. But Kelvin didn't see it as a gamble. He saw it as an inevitability. Africa's population was growing rapidly, and so was its hunger for information. The only question was whether Africans would wait decades for foreign companies to solve the problem, or build the solution themselves. By the time Kelvin graduated, he had already drawn up the technical blueprint for his first prototype satellite. Without access to billions of dollars, he knew he would have to start small. He began by building a ground-based system to simulate how his satellite signals would be transmitted and received. He converted a metal shed into a makeshift laboratory, filling it with computers, soldering irons, and testing equipment. Friends and neighbors thought he was crazy, but curiosity kept them coming back to see what he was doing. When he finally demonstrated a working prototype of his transmission system, the room was filled with stunned silence. The signal traveled farther and faster than anyone had expected, even under challenging conditions. This small victory gave him the confidence to start reaching out to potential investors. He pitched his vision not as a luxury service, but as a necessity for Africa's future. He explained how better connectivity could transform schools by giving students access to online libraries and virtual classrooms. He described how rural hospitals could use telemedicine to connect with specialists in big cities. He spoke of farmers using real-time weather data to protect their crops and improve yields. Some investors were intrigued, others were skeptical, but one thing was clear: Kelvin had the kind of conviction that was hard to ignore. Eventually, he secured a modest seed investment from a small but forward-thinking venture capital firm. This allowed him to hire a small team of engineers, many of whom were African graduates eager to work on a project that could change their continent. They worked long hours, sometimes sleeping in the lab, driven by the belief that they were building more than just satellites. They were building the foundation for a new Africa. The early days of Kelvin's satellite company were a mix of chaos, learning curves, and small victories. They didn't have the sprawling research campuses of global tech giants, but they had grit, ingenuity, and an unshakable belief in their mission. Their first big milestone was building a small, low-cost satellite prototype capable of basic data transmission. It wasn't powerful enough to serve millions of users, but it was proof that their concept worked. Kelvin decided early on that his satellites would operate in low Earth orbit, or LEO, to reduce latency and provide faster speeds compared to traditional geostationary satellites. This decision meant they would need more satellites in the constellation, but it also meant they could deliver an internet experience good enough to rival fiber in urban areas. To keep costs down, the team designed modular satellites that could be mass-produced using local manufacturing facilities wherever possible. Kelvin was determined that his project would create jobs and build capacity in Africa, not just rely on imported components. He began reaching out to universities and technical institutes to form partnerships for research and development. Students and professors alike were excited to contribute, knowing that this could be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to shape Africa's technological future. But enthusiasm alone wouldn't put satellites into orbit. They still needed launch partners, ground station infrastructure, and regulatory clearance from multiple African governments. The regulatory side proved to be one of the biggest headaches in the early stages. Some governments welcomed the idea, seeing it as a way to accelerate development. Others were cautious, concerned about data sovereignty, national security, and the potential for foreign influence. Kelvin spent months traveling across the continent, meeting with ministers and telecom regulators to explain how his network would operate. He promised that the data centers and key operational hubs would be located in Africa to ensure local control. He even proposed a revenue-sharing model that would give governments a financial stake in the network's success. Slowly, the resistance began to soften, and Kelvin secured the necessary approvals in his first set of target countries. Meanwhile, his engineers were refining the satellite design to make it more efficient and durable. They tested components under extreme heat, cold, and vibration to simulate the harsh conditions of space. Every successful test brought them one step closer to their goal, but every failure was a painful reminder of how high the stakes were. Kelvin often reminded his team that they weren't just competing against other companies, they were racing against time. Every year that passed without universal connectivity meant millions of African students would miss out on educational opportunities. It meant small businesses would remain isolated from global markets. It meant doctors in rural clinics would continue working without access to critical medical resources. The urgency was not lost on anyone. In the second year of the project, Kelvin announced that they would begin assembling their first batch of operational satellites. To save money, they partnered with a mid-sized European aerospace company that specialized in small satellite launches. This partnership came with its own challenges: cultural differences, communication barriers, and the inevitable delays of complex engineering projects. But Kelvin was patient when it came to execution, even if he was impatient about the mission. He knew that rushing could lead to costly mistakes in space. The first launch was scheduled for a crisp, clear morning at a European spaceport. Kelvin stood in the control room, his hands clasped tightly, as the countdown clock ticked toward zero. The roar of the rocket engines filled the air, and the room erupted in applause as the vehicle lifted off the pad. For several tense minutes, all eyes were glued to the telemetry data streaming across the monitors. Finally, the mission director confirmed that the satellites had been deployed successfully into orbit. Kelvin exhaled for what felt like the first time all morning. It was a historic moment, not just for him, but for everyone who believed in the idea that Africa could build its own space-powered future. Within weeks, the first test signals from the satellites began reaching ground stations in multiple countries. Engineers monitored the data closely, measuring signal strength, speed, and reliability. There were hiccups, as expected, but overall the performance exceeded expectations. This early success attracted the attention of larger investors, including several African billionaires who had made their fortunes in mining, agriculture, and telecommunications. They saw Kelvin's network not just as a business opportunity, but as a chance to leave a legacy. With this new funding, Kelvin expanded his team and accelerated the production schedule for additional satellites. He also began building more ground stations to ensure seamless coverage across wide areas. At the same time, his marketing team began rolling out campaigns to raise public awareness about the upcoming service. In rural areas, where internet access had always been a distant dream, anticipation was building. Community leaders began reaching out to ask when their towns would be connected. Kelvin's vision was becoming real enough that people could taste it. And yet, behind the scenes, the work was only getting harder. The logistics of coordinating satellite launches, building ground infrastructure, and navigating multiple regulatory systems was exhausting. There were days when Kelvin would fall asleep at his desk and wake up with his phone still in his hand. But each time he visited a rural school or health clinic, he was reminded why the sacrifices were worth it. On one trip, he met a teacher who had been using a single outdated textbook to teach an entire classroom. She told Kelvin that with a stable internet connection, she could access thousands of free teaching materials instantly. Her eyes welled with tears as she said, "You're not just building satellites, you're building futures." Moments like that fueled Kelvin's determination even more. By the end of the third year, his constellation had grown to include dozens of operational satellites. Coverage was spreading rapidly, and beta testing had begun in several countries. Early users reported that the service was fast, reliable, and affordable compared to existing options. For some, it was the first time they had ever made a video call without the connection dropping. For others, it was the first time they could download a file in seconds instead of hours. Kelvin's network wasn't just about speed, it was about freedom. Freedom to learn, to work, to communicate, and to dream without barriers. And this was only the beginning. Kelvin knew that momentum was everything in a project of this scale. If they slowed down, competitors could catch up or political changes could stall progress. So instead of taking a victory lap after the early launches, he doubled down on expansion. He pushed his engineers to scale production without compromising on quality. He negotiated bulk deals for satellite components to bring down costs. He even began exploring partnerships with African airlines to host onboard internet hubs connected directly to his satellites. These airborne relays could extend coverage to areas without ground stations, especially during the early rollout. At the same time, his legal team was busy working through new agreements with additional governments. Every new country brought its own mix of enthusiasm, caution, and bureaucracy. Kelvin had learned to speak not just in the language of technology, but in the language of national pride. He presented his project as a symbol of African unity, innovation, and independence. This framing resonated deeply with leaders who wanted to show their citizens that their countries could be technological pioneers. In some cases, governments even offered tax breaks and subsidies to speed up deployment. Meanwhile, Kelvin's marketing team began producing documentaries and short videos showing the human impact of the network. They filmed children in remote villages taking online classes for the first time. They captured the joy of farmers using weather forecasting tools to protect their harvests. They interviewed doctors who could now consult with international specialists in real time. These stories became powerful tools for building public support. They also made it harder for skeptics to dismiss Kelvin's vision as unrealistic or unnecessary. The results of the beta tests continued to impress. Internet speeds were competitive with urban fiber networks, and latency was low enough for smooth video calls and online gaming. Kelvin knew that to truly win over the public, the service had to be not just available, but affordable. So he introduced tiered pricing, with deep discounts for schools, clinics, and low-income households. He also set up community access points where people could connect for free in public spaces. These hotspots quickly became hubs of activity, students doing homework, traders checking market prices, and families calling relatives abroad. Word of mouth spread quickly, and soon demand outpaced the network's capacity. This was both a blessing and a challenge. The surge in usage proved that Kelvin had tapped into a massive unmet need. But it also meant they had to accelerate satellite launches to keep up with demand. He began exploring regional manufacturing hubs to produce components faster and closer to the point of assembly. In one bold move, he announced that the company would establish Africa's first dedicated satellite assembly facility. This would not only create jobs but also reduce reliance on foreign suppliers. The announcement made headlines across the continent, cementing Kelvin's status as a visionary leader. Yet with fame came new pressures. Critics began questioning whether one man should have so much control over Africa's digital infrastructure. Some worried about data privacy, monopolistic behavior, or the risk of political influence. Kelvin took these concerns seriously. He set up an independent oversight board with members from civil society, academia, and the tech industry. Their job was to ensure that the network operated transparently and in the public interest. This move won him praise and helped defuse some of the political tension. Still, not all challenges could be managed so easily. In one particularly tense episode, a scheduled launch was delayed due to an international dispute over orbital slot allocation. Without the necessary permissions, the satellites would risk interfering with other networks. Kelvin's team worked around the clock with global space agencies to resolve the issue. Eventually, a compromise was reached, but the incident underscored how vulnerable the project was to forces beyond their control. Even so, Kelvin remained undeterred. He told his team, "Obstacles are just problems we haven't solved yet." By the fifth year of the project, the constellation had grown to cover more than 70% of the continent. Rural schools were streaming educational videos daily. Small businesses were selling products to customers halfway around the world. Local governments were digitizing their services, reducing corruption and improving efficiency. The transformation was undeniable. Kelvin began receiving invitations to speak at global technology conferences alongside the likes of Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and other industry titans. But unlike many of his peers, Kelvin always framed his achievements in terms of collective progress rather than individual glory. He insisted that his company's greatest success would be measured not in profits, but in the number of lives it touched. And touch lives it did. From fishermen in coastal villages tracking weather to avoid storms, to nurses in rural clinics ordering medicine online, the network was weaving itself into the daily fabric of life. Kelvin's dream was no longer just his own, it had become Africa's dream. Yet he knew that the road ahead was still long. There were still millions without access, still technical hurdles to overcome, still political landscapes to navigate. But for the first time, universal connectivity in Africa felt within reach. Part 2 of Kelvin's journey would not just be about building satellites, but about building a connected, empowered, and self-sufficient Africa. And the world was starting to pay attention. Kelvin's satellite network had reached a tipping point. What began as a bold dream in a cramped workshop was now a force reshaping economies, education systems, and healthcare across Africa. In just a few short years, millions had come online for the first time. Entire communities that once lived in isolation were now part of the global conversation. But with growth came complexity. The technical challenge of managing hundreds of satellites in low Earth orbit was staggering. Each one had to be monitored, maintained, and occasionally maneuvered to avoid collisions. Space debris was a growing concern, and Kelvin's engineers had to design autonomous systems capable of detecting and avoiding hazards in real time. They also implemented advanced deorbiting procedures to ensure that satellites at the end of their life cycles would safely burn up in the atmosphere. This attention to sustainability earned Kelvin praise from international space agencies. Yet managing the physical network was only part of the challenge. The surge in users meant that Kelvin's team had to continually expand ground station capacity and upgrade software to handle massive amounts of data. Cybersecurity became a top priority. Hackers, both amateur and state-sponsored, saw the network as a tempting target.
Kelvin
Responded by assembling one of the most skilled cybersecurity teams in Africa, recruiting talent from across the continent. These specialists worked around the clock to defend the network from intrusion, protect user privacy, and maintain trust. Meanwhile, the economic effects of widespread connectivity were becoming visible in ways few had predicted. In rural Kenya, farmers were pooling resources to purchase modern irrigation systems, guided by online tutorials and remote consultations with experts abroad. In West Africa, young entrepreneurs were launching e-commerce platforms that served not just their local cities, but international markets. Mobile payment adoption skyrocketed, enabling small vendors to sell to customers they had never met in person. Local artisans began streaming live sales events, showcasing handmade crafts to buyers across Europe and Asia. The education sector saw a revolution of its own. In remote classrooms where teachers once relied solely on chalkboards, students now participated in live virtual lessons with instructors thousands of miles away. Access to free online courses meant that ambitious learners could study coding, engineering, and business management without ever leaving their hometowns. This, in turn, fueled a new wave of local startups run by people who previously had no pathway into the tech industry. Healthcare transformation was equally dramatic. Telemedicine reduced the need for patients to travel long distances to see specialists. Doctors could share high-resolution images of X-rays or ultrasounds instantly with experts in other countries. Medical supply chains improved as hospitals began using data-driven inventory systems that prevented shortages. In one memorable case, a rural clinic in Ethiopia successfully performed a complex surgery with real-time guidance from surgeons in South Africa. Stories like this spread quickly, reinforcing the idea that Kelvin's network was more than just an internet service. It was an engine of life-changing opportunity. However, not everyone celebrated the changes. Traditional telecom companies saw their market share shrink and began lobbying against Kelvin's network. Some governments, worried about losing control over information flow, introduced restrictive regulations. Kelvin faced a difficult choice: comply with these restrictions and compromise the openness of his network, or risk losing access to key markets. In most cases, he chose dialogue over confrontation. He met with policymakers to explain how an open, affordable internet was essential for economic growth. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. The most challenging opposition came from outside Africa. International satellite providers began lowering their prices and aggressively marketing their services in African markets. They saw Kelvin's rise as a threat to their dominance. But Kelvin's advantage lay in his deep understanding of local needs. His team could respond faster, adapt pricing models, and tailor services for rural and low-income users in ways foreign competitors couldn't match. Still, staying ahead required constant innovation. Kelvin invested heavily in research to improve satellite efficiency, reduce launch costs, and expand coverage into underserved regions. He also began experimenting with integrating his network with emerging technologies like 5G and edge computing. This would allow devices to process data locally, reducing latency even further. The goal was to make Africa not just a consumer of global technology, but a leader in its development. Kelvin believed that connectivity should be a platform for creating, not just consuming. That belief began to take root in communities across the continent. Hackathons, tech incubators, and innovation hubs sprang up in cities and towns that had never before been part of the digital economy. Young Africans were designing apps, launching online businesses, and developing AI tools tailored to local challenges. Some of these startups even began exporting their products internationally, reversing the traditional flow of technology from the global north to the global south. Kelvin's network had become a catalyst for a cultural shift, one where Africa saw itself not as a follower, but as an innovator. Yet the road ahead was still uncertain. The cost of maintaining and upgrading the constellation was enormous. Kelvin needed to secure long-term funding, and that meant expanding his investor base beyond Africa. He embarked on a global tour, meeting with venture capital firms, sovereign wealth funds, and impact investors. His pitch was simple but powerful. Investing in African connectivity wasn't just profitable, it was transformative. By connecting 1 billion people, they could unlock trillions in untapped economic potential. The message resonated with some, but others remained cautious. The satellite industry was notoriously capital-intensive, and many feared the risks of political instability, currency fluctuations, and infrastructure challenges. Kelvin countered with data showing steady user growth, rising revenues, and tangible social impact. Slowly, more investors came on board, giving him the resources to push toward full continental coverage. And beyond Africa, new opportunities were emerging. Neighboring regions with similar connectivity challenges began expressing interest in partnering with Kelvin's company. The Middle East, parts of South America, and even small island nations saw potential in replicating his model. Kelvin realized that what began as a mission for Africa could become a global blueprint for affordable, inclusive internet access. But global expansion brought new questions about identity and control. Would his company remain an African-led initiative, or would international investors gradually take the reins? Kelvin was determined to keep leadership rooted in Africa, even as the network's reach grew. He believed that the story of his company was inseparable from the story of African innovation. And that story was still being written. Kelvin's network was now within striking distance of achieving complete African coverage. From the wind-swept deserts of Namibia to the lush rainforests of the Congo, his satellites had created an invisible web that bound the continent together. It was a kind of unity that had never existed before, not political, not economic, but digital. For the first time, a child in a remote mountain village could have the same access to information as a student in a major city. This digital equality was changing mindsets. Young people no longer saw their geography as a limitation. They could learn, collaborate, and build alongside peers from anywhere in the world. Kelvin began to see the next generation of innovators emerging from the very communities that had once been considered unreachable. Some were developing agricultural AI systems to improve crop yields. Others were building blockchain platforms for secure land ownership records. Many were simply creating content, videos, music, and art that shared African culture with the world. The cultural exchange worked both ways. African perspectives began influencing global conversations in ways they hadn't before. Music collaborations between Nigerian and South Korean artists trended internationally. Kenyan filmmakers partnered with European studios to produce films that reached streaming audiences worldwide. The internet had become not just a tool for consuming global culture, but for exporting African creativity. Kelvin watched these developments with quiet pride. He knew that his satellites were the unseen enablers of these stories. But even as the network matured, challenges kept surfacing. One unexpected issue came from the very success of the project: the sheer volume of data traffic. As more people streamed videos, joined virtual classrooms, and played online games, the demand for bandwidth grew exponentially. Kelvin's engineers raced to optimize network efficiency and expand satellite capacity. They experimented with laser-based inter-satellite links to speed up communication between satellites without routing data through the ground. This innovation allowed the network to handle heavier loads while reducing latency even further. Meanwhile, global events began to highlight the importance of resilient connectivity. Natural disasters that once cut off entire regions from the outside world now had minimal impact, as Kelvin's satellites could quickly reroute data. During political unrest in some countries, the network provided uninterrupted access to information when other systems failed. This resilience earned Kelvin both admiration and scrutiny. Some governments praised the network for keeping their citizens informed. Others were uneasy about not being able to fully control the flow of information. Kelvin remained committed to keeping the internet open and free, but he knew this stance could bring political risks. He relied on diplomacy, transparency, and alliances with respected civil society organizations to navigate these tensions. By the 7th year, Kelvin's company had become one of Africa's most valuable tech enterprises. It was valued in the billions, yet Kelvin still refused to take it public on foreign stock exchanges. He wanted to keep majority ownership in African hands, ensuring that decisions about the continent's connectivity were made by those who understood its needs. This decision inspired other African tech leaders to think beyond short-term profits and focus on long-term sovereignty. The ripple effects of Kelvin's approach were spreading into other industries. Energy companies began using satellite data to map potential renewable energy sites. Logistics firms optimized delivery routes using real-time mapping services powered by Kelvin's network. Even wildlife conservation groups used the satellites to track endangered species and combat poaching. Everywhere you looked, the network's influence was felt. In finance, microlending platforms flourished, allowing small entrepreneurs to access credit for the first time. In tourism, virtual reality tours brought African heritage sites to a global audience, boosting interest and travel. In sports, live-streamed matches from rural stadiums reached fans around the world, giving local teams unprecedented exposure. Kelvin had always known that connectivity would spark unexpected innovations, but the scale and speed still amazed him. International media began calling him not just the African Elon, but a pioneer in his own right. Documentaries chronicled his journey from a small-town dreamer to a space-age leader. Yet Kelvin often deflected personal praise, redirecting attention to his team and the communities that had embraced the network. He believed that technology alone could not transform Africa. It needed people willing to use it to solve real problems. That belief shaped the company's next big initiative, a continent-wide mentorship and funding program for young innovators. Through this program, Kelvin offered seed funding, technical support, and satellite connectivity to promising projects in every African nation. The results were staggering. In just 2 years, hundreds of startups emerged from rural towns and urban centers alike. Many tackled challenges unique to their regions, from climate change adaptation to language preservation. Some of these startups even began exporting their solutions globally, turning Africa into a source of technological exports. The global perception of Africa as merely a developing continent was shifting. It was now seen as a place where the future was being built in real time. Kelvin's story became a case study in universities worldwide. His speeches drew crowds of thousands, both online and in person. When asked what his proudest moment was, Kelvin always returned to a simple memory: the first time he saw children in his hometown using his network to attend an online science class. In that moment, the dream had come full circle. What had once been an idea sketched in notebooks and built in a dusty workshop was now touching millions of lives. And Kelvin wasn't done. He had already begun researching the next generation of satellites, lighter, faster, and even more efficient. He envisioned a future where Africa's network would not just connect people to the internet, but serve as the backbone for AI systems, advanced environmental monitoring, and space-based manufacturing. In his mind, Africa's space age was only beginning.